Our speaker today is Graham Cottrell. Graham is well known at the Air Force Association, where he works a couple of days a week, and he is in charge of the workshop, the restoration workshop. He's going to tell you how he became interested in aviation, and that was in New Zealand, and came to Western Australia and farmed for a number of years with, and had a 172 which he flew around the countryside and was only recently sold. Graham, come forward.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I can see, or I realised today, that I'd made a mistake. I learned fairly early on in my interest in aircraft, when I joined the Air Training Corps while I was at school, I learned 2 or 3 things. And the first one was never to volunteer for anything. And I went and did that for today. So I think I made a big mistake. But the other was to be a bit selective with the truth. I hope I won't be selective today. I'll tell you as it happened as far as I was concerned. I'm really talking about aviation memories for me over the last 50 or nearly 60 years. Now, as I mentioned, I joined the Air Training Corps in 1944 while I was still at high school, and we appeared to be winning the war at that time, and sitting in an aeroplane flying appeared to be much more desirable than marching with a rifle. So that's how I joined the Air Training Corps. And the Royal New Zealand Air Force saw fit to give me my first ride in an aeroplane in a Tiger Moth, which was great fun. I thought, gee, this is not bad. So my interest sort of quickened a bit after that. But the war finished and I left school, and my next brush with aircraft was at an airfield near a town called Hamilton in the North Island of New Zealand. And I was taken to this quite large grass airfield, and on 3 sides was the startling sight of 450 aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, nose to tail. And they were being cut up and melted down, thrown into a furnace. There were P-40s, there were Corsairs, there were Jackson.Avengers, there were Venturas, there were Hudsons. There were just about everything that the Royal New Zealand Air Force had used during the Pacific campaign. Now, as Brian remarked, most of what I'm going to talk about is based in New Zealand. When I first arrived in I'm getting all mixed up, Western Australia, I bought a farm at Kajana. Now, one of the first people I met said, "Another New Zealander," he said, "and we just got rid of the bloody rabbits." So that wasn't a bad welcome. But no, I had 30 wonderful years in Kajana. But to go back to New Zealand, when I'd seen all these aircraft at Rukahia being cut up, I thought, gee, there's some pretty useful stuff in some of those things. I'll keep an eye out. And I did put a tender in for a Mosquito once, but I didn't get that. And then I noticed a tender for 6 only, airspeed Oxfords. The last 6 in the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and they had quite a lot of them originally. They had about 300. But the last 6 were up for sale at Wigram Air Force Base. So I thought, oh, okay, let's go and have a look at this. So I tootled off and went down and had a look at these 6 forlorn Oxfords standing out in the weather. And anybody who knows anything about Oxfords will realise there, I see a few knowing looks around the place, but you will know that they're plywood and fabric and do not respond well to wet weather. Anyway, I thought, well, fair enough, I'll see if I can get 4 or 5 others interested in buying one, because I didn't want 6 of the wretched things, I wanted 1. So I soon got others interested, and one of them said, "Oh, I'll get my mate in Christchurch, who was an ex-army man, to go out and have a look at them," in spite of this chap admitting that the only thing he knew about aeroplanes was to dodge the bastards with the black crosses on them. Anyway, we ultimately decided to put a tender in for £186, the lot. £31 each. We knew there wasn't a lot salvageable on them, there wasn't a lot of metal that we could sell, but hydraulic gear and all sorts of goodies that can be useful on a farm. So I put the tender in and it was duly accepted. Then was the problem, get the damn things home. It was 60 miles. So I got a permit from the traffic people and we descended on Wigram to take the wings off. Now, it looks perhaps at first sight to be quite a job, but it really wasn't. It was quite simple. We soon found that once we tore a strip of fabric off the join, that there were only two king bolts held the wings on. One in the main spar and another in the back spar. So all we had to do was undo the aileron controls, the fuel lines, and knock the pins out, and the wings came off. About 15 minutes or so. So we did that fairly quickly. And even so, they were still outboard of the engines. They were 18 feet. With taking on the road is quite wide. But in those days, and I'm talking 1954, 1953, 54, there wasn't the volume of traffic there is now. So we really didn't have any trouble. We just hitched the tails up onto whatever vehicle we had and took off on the main road. It must have looked a queer convoy. But we got there. That one is yours truly at Duxford in the UK, standing in front of their very, very well preserved Oxford. Now that one is NZ 2143, standing on the roadside the next morning after I had dragged it from Christchurch. As you can see, the wing is attached up. See the wing, that was all we could do to transport the wings, and lashed them onto the fuselage. Well then, I spent years of fun pulling it apart. Hindsight's always easy, and if we had built a shed and put the wretched thing in it, we could have made a lot of money. But as it was, we sold the seat harnesses to the stock car people. They were very good seat harnesses, the pilot and co-pilot. So we got our money back for the seat harnesses. So they didn't really owe us a hell of a lot. Now in 1956, the Americans turned up to start the International Geophysical Year in the Antarctic. They weren't there for the good of their health, you can bet your boots on that. They wanted to get established in the Antarctic for strategic reasons as much as anything else. And these are some of the aircraft they used. Now, if you look carefully at the Neptune, you'll see it's got skis on it. It was fitted with skis and could land almost anywhere. Now, the bottom aircraft is a C-124 Globemaster. Anybody familiar with them?
Seen them.
They, even by today's standards, they're a pretty big aeroplane with four 28-cylinder radials, 4-row radials. They really were quite a large aircraft. Yeah?
One of those came to Perth Airport back in the late 50s or 60s.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I understand they went to Exmouth too, and were used for supply. But they could, I believe, hold 200 fully equipped troops. But they were a very large aircraft, and those big motors operated on a diet of 145 octane fuel, so it was pretty hot stuff. And as far as I'm aware, they never lost one between New Zealand and the Antarctic. I remember seeing one or two just after takeoff, and they were flying like that. They were so heavily loaded that that they had a perpetual nose-up attitude until they burned a lot of fuel off. But they were quite an aircraft and were in service for quite a few years. Now, I've skipped a bit, but I'm moving to air shows. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of Warbirds over Wanaka.
Yeah.
Any of you been there?
Yep.
Oh, quite a few. Good, great. Now, this show was started by Tim Wallace, who is now Sir Tim Wallace. He made a lot of money out of deer shooting from helicopters, and later than that, deer catching for deer farming. And he made a great deal of money out of it, and he was also a mad keen aviation enthusiast. He decided that he would like to have a Spitfire, so he acquired one. He would like a Mustang, so he acquired one. He would like an Avenger, so he got one of those too. And he set up an air show which started in a very small way and got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the only one, the last one I've got records for, there were 100,000 people attended. And that is a lot of people when they're all together. You can see in that photograph the scale of things. The cars parked there, there were visitors' private aircraft all parked there. A huge show in a highly spectacular scenic property. One that anybody should pay a visit to, even without an air show. It's very much worth going. That is Tim's Spitfire. The Hurricane's parked next to it. Now, the Hurricane was an 8-year restoration project that Tim Wallace financed. And they made a magnificent job of it. It really is a superb aircraft. They're parked just on the aircraft parking area at Wanaka, and the bottom photograph is of the pilot's cockpit. Now, ex-Spitfire people will know, will recognise that straight away. There's the Hurricane. Got a few panels off, but it was flying on that particular day. Really a superb restoration job. And there are the two of them on takeoff from the strip. You can see by the mountains, there's another well-known one too, the 109. Wallace had these, imported them from the UK. He was very friendly with Ray Hanna of the old Flying Machine Company, and Hanna operated every year. He came out and flew at the Warbirds show every year, and he brought this 109 with him. P40, sometimes there's been 2 or 3 P40s there, and that is the Avenger. I was a bit lighter in those days than I am now, but they were pretty impressive aeroplanes. That particular aircraft is now domiciled in Queensland. The Catalina operates regularly. It belongs to the New Zealand Warbirds Association and is normally based in Auckland. But it comes down to fly-ins like Wanaka, and also one that I'll mention later. But I was lucky to get a ride in it. It cost me $100 for the ride, $60 for the flight and $40 to join the Catalina Support Association. But it was well worth it. I knew I'd never do it again. And you can see the photo in the flight deck. The pilot was an orthopaedic surgeon from Auckland, I believe, and that's what he did for his spare time. Now, another interesting type that turned up was this Blériot, which is a genuine one. It's not a replica. It was unearthed in Sweden and restored to flying condition, and the owner brought it out, and the owner was flying it. Now you can see it was pretty simple, and that's the same type that first flew the English Channel. There he is flying, not very high, but he came past, he went and turned and came back past the crowd. Look, Mum, no hands. You're sitting up there. Yes, he was quite a character, and he had a very good-looking wife. Now, here you can see a row of 5 Russian Polikarpov I-16 aircraft, and a couple of DC-3s in the background, and various other types flying about the place. These aircraft Wallace had restored in Russia. He had dealings with people who were into deer farming in Russia and had some contacts, and he eventually got these aircraft restored to original condition. And when you think that these Polikarpovs were designed and built in about 1935, 36, they had 1,000 horsepower radial on them. Each cylinder, its exhaust pipe just stuck out the side of the fuselage, so they're a bit noisy, very noisy, real bark with them. And I believe very tricky to fly, but highly manoeuvrable. And at that time, they were the most advanced aircraft around. Nobody else had anything to touch them. They didn't go any further forward than that. And they also built a biplane, which is the top picture. And that also had a retractable gear, but it was operated by a cable, and the pilot had to wind the thing up, and if he missed his grip, the handle nearly took his knuckles off. But they didn't believe in creature comforts because they didn't have an enclosed cockpit. They only had a windscreen and a fairing behind the pilot's head, but they were a fairly basic sort of an aeroplane. Now, I've gone back to Oshkosh. Now, I happened to be on the first Oshkosh Express Qantas 747 that landed at Oshkosh. Now, it was the biggest plane load of licensed pilots, there were about 300 or so of us on board, that had ever flown anywhere, let alone to Oshkosh. So I was walking, after getting off the aircraft, I was walking along the flight line, and the Lancaster taxied past, and that just gives you some idea of the relative sizes of them. We all thought the Lanc was a pretty big aeroplane, but when placed alongside the 747, I think the span of the tail, the horizontal stabilisers on the 747 would be nearly as much as the total wingspan of the Lancaster. But they did make quite a contrasting sight. That the flight in there on the 747 was quite an experience, and everybody, or a number of people on the flight, had radio scanners and were listening to the control tower as we approached Oshkosh. And when we landed, a beautiful landing which was clapped vigorously by everybody, we heard the controller asked if he wanted the aid of the tractor to take it to a parking area. The captain said, "Thanks, but no thanks, we'll manage," and he did. He taxied the aircraft in, and we all disembarked, and then they dragged it out onto the main runway, and the tractor broke down. So she was sitting there for quite a while with the engines running. But that was an interesting experience, and I have been to Oshkosh a couple of times, and feel I was very lucky. There's the Lancaster, one of only 2 flying in the world. That belongs to the Canadian War Heritage Museum, and was the subject of a 10-year rebuild when they got it back in the air. Now, some of the Canadians associated with it got a bit cheesed off with Americans coming along and saying, what sort of a Boeing's this? They didn't think much of that. But one of them said to me, will you be here this afternoon? And I said, yes, why? Well, he said, you might see something that you may never see again. And I said, what's that, you and the Mozzie flying together? And he said, yes. And that's exactly what happened. Kermit Weeks had his Mosquito there, and there was also a B-29. And the three of them took off practically together, and were quite an impressive sight. A very impressive sight indeed. Now that's Kermit Weeks's Mosquito, and that was airborne. I don't think it is now, but it was one of only two in the world at that time that were still flying. Now, I'm jumping a bit. You've all heard stories at various times of a Spitfire or something parked in an old hangar on a wartime airstrip somewhere away up in the northwest. I heard the stories pretty soon after I came to WA. Of course, they were all myth, but a Kiwi friend of mine was staying with me, and the subject got round to aeroplanes as it does with me as a rule. Oh, he said, I know where there's a Mosquito in a shed. I said, yeah. Oh yes, he said, it is. And I candidly didn't believe it. I thought, well, this is another urban myth.
Jimmy
and
Woods. Was it Jimmy Woods? Is that for
no, it wasn't. But I said, look, I'll hold you to that. I said, I'm coming over to New Zealand next year to Warbirds, and I'll come up to Nelson, and I'll get in touch with you. Oh, okay, so that'll be all right. So I eventually did, and I rang him, and I said, Mick, what about this Mosquito? Well, he said, I'll go down and see the guy. He said, he's a recluse. He said, he hasn't got a telephone, lives on his own, looked after his old mum until she fell off the twig, and then he just collected aeroplanes. So we arranged to meet at a certain place at Mapua the next day, and Julie did, and he led us up a back road and then turned off into a driveway, and there was long grass, and I thought, oh God, what are we letting ourselves in for? And then I began to see bits of aeroplanes sticking out of the grass, engine mounts and one or two other things. And I thought, hello, hello. And we pulled into a yard, and directly in front of where we were parked was a trailer with 2 pairs of P-40 wings on it. And Mick went and got the chap out of his house, and he came out and put a key in the padlock and opened this big door. And right above my head was the starboard spinner and propeller of a complete Mosquito, a Mark 6 Mosquito, the only complete one in New Zealand, and it's been there for over 50 years, and it is still there today. It is still in the shed. I said, look, any chance of having a look in the cockpit? So he got the original Mosquito ladder, unlocked the door, and I climbed up into, and there's me sitting in the pilot's seat. That was quite something. And the cabin and cockpit was so neat and tidy and so complete, you would have sworn it had flown last week. And that, I kid you not, that aeroplane is still there. It's still in the shed. And I understand he's been offered a very large amount of money for it, but he's not interested in money, which makes him a very rare bird indeed. This Mosquito's not the only thing. He had 2 P-40s in there, in the shed, behind the Mosquito. That's where the wings came from. One had been chopped off with a gas torch. And he had a Mustang, a Hudson bomber, less wings, a Harvard, or Texan, as you call them here, and a Tiger Moth, are all in this shed. Most extraordinary collection of stuff. Engines, he had 2 big Bristol engines from a Bristol freighter, and parts, you name it. I think he just everything. It was like Aladdin's cave. So that's Kermit Weeks' mosquitoes. So now those were the Royal New Zealand Air Force mosquitoes that were up for sale at Woodburn. Now I had a little black and white photo of these in my wallet, and I pulled it out and said to the owner, John Smith was his name, very unusual name, but I said to him, this is the lot at Woodburn, and he pointed, he said, it wasn't that one, it was that one there, and that's the one that's in the shed. And I understand he paid about £30 for it when he bought it. He took it apart where it was and transported it across the hills to Nelson, which was a major job, believe me, for anybody, let alone somebody who perhaps, well, he wasn't an expert at it, but he knew a fair bit about mosquitoes. Now, Blenheim is where they have the classic Wings air show. In the alternate years when the Warbirds over Wanaka is not running, the classic Wings at Omaka, they have put on their air show, and they concentrate on First World War aircraft. Now a lot of you will recognise that as a Camel, Sopwith Camel, with an original rotary engine. It's a replica, but the engine is not. The engine's original. And when it was flying, it sounded like a crash looking for some place to happen, because the engine is just the most unusual sound. Now that one was actually flying that day too. That's a DH2. That is no longer flying, but it is in a museum, the Aviation Heritage Museum, that is worth a visit to Blenheim on its own, believe me. And anybody passing that way that is in the least bit interested in aircraft shouldn't miss it. It has been largely done by the guy who is the director of the films Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson. He's not only a director and made a lot of money, but he's also an aviation enthusiast, which is a very useful thing to be if you've got a lot of money. Now, I'm jumping again, and I've gone to Queensland. This is in a collection owned by a chap by the name of Sid Beck. He's got a most extraordinary collection over there, and that is, well, there's not too many air cobras around the place, and that's one of them. I did hear that it was going to be restored to flying condition, but I couldn't vouch for that. Brian took this photo, I didn't. I did the sectioning of that cheetah engine. I had seen one done in the Royal New Zealand Air Force Museum in Christchurch, and I looked at it, I thought, gee, I think I could probably do that. And I took a photo of it, and came back, and the curator eventually said, yes, okay, that's your project. So that's what I did, and had a fascinating time doing it, because not too many people know how a radial engine works, and that's why I cut a cylinder clean out of it. It was only a 7-cylinder engine, so I cut one right out and cut a piece out of the crankcase, and had some bits chrome plated, and it made quite a good display. I did a Gypsy 6 too, but I didn't have half as much fun with that one. Particularly as the crankcase was largely magnesium, and when you're cutting these things with a big angle grinder, it cuts okay until you strike a steel stud, and you know what happens when you apply a spark to magnesium powder, and that's exactly what did happen. I set my overalls on fire and had quite a lot of fun with it. Now, when I'd got myself established on my farm, I thought, gee, yeah, I'd love to learn to fly. And time went by, and I didn't have the money, I didn't have the time. Eventually I thought, well, when I got to the age of 51, I thought, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. So I came up and saw John Douglas, and we had a discussion, and he said, well, you know, no time like the present. And I said, oh, too old. Nah, never, he said, never. So in the end I said, right, okay, I'll do it, as long as you do the instructing. Well, he was as good as his word, and he did. He did the instructing. And that was in 1979. And I eventually got my private pilot's license and flew from Katanning for quite some time in the Flying Club 172. And I got sick of traipsing backwards and forwards to Katanning for half an hour's flying. So I thought, well, it's time I bought something myself. And I was talking to the late and highly respected Don Endy one day. And in fact, I got him down to Cajun up to talk to the Rotary Club, and he really was excellent. But I put him up for the night, and we were sitting around talking, and I mentioned that I was interested in buying a 172. Oh, he said, would you like my boys to go up to Jandakot and have a look at it? I said, gee, would I ever? So he did, and he rang me back, and he said, yes. He said, there's one just come in from up north, an old 172, an old G model. And he said, they reckon it was a pretty good sound aeroplane. So after a bit of haggling, that's what I bought. And I flew it for 21 years and delivered it to its new owner, 21 years to the day from when I first flew it. It was a wonderful old thing, not spectacular. A lot of people would say, nah, you know, there's nothing very interesting flying those old things. But I flew it because I loved being up in the air, and it was just sheer joy of flying. I couldn't justify it. People said, you know, oh, it would be useful, and I said, no, it wasn't. It wasn't useful at all. It was sheer plaything, and I never regretted 1 minute of it. It was a wonderful old aeroplane, and I was very sad to get rid of it. But when I got to the age of 80, I thought, well, it's time, I think. I'll go before I get pushed or do something stupid. So I went, and I haven't touched an aeroplane since my 80th birthday. I haven't touched one as pilot in command. So I've had a tremendously at least interesting to me, it might be interesting to everybody. I've had an interesting time around aeroplanes. I don't think there's anything else left there. And I hope I haven't bored you too much, but thank you for listening to me.